"Take your hands off my son." The words were quiet, almost swallowed by the steady rain tapping against the white canopy stretched above the cemetery. Yet every head turned before Officer Daniel Reed realized why they had frozen the air around him. Judge Evelyn Grace Monroe did not pull away when his gloved hand closed around her wrist. She simply looked at him with tired brown eyes that had spent too many sleepless nights staring at a bedroom that would never again hear her son's footsteps. Her black wool coat was damp along the shoulders, and a pair of worn leather gloves, once belonging to her late husband, David, covered hands that trembled only from grief, never from fear. In front of her rested the polished walnut casket carrying 28-year-old Jordan Monroe, a beloved public high school music teacher whose former students stood silently beneath umbrellas, clutching silver trumpets and clarinets as though music itself had forgotten how to breathe. Reverend Samuel Price had paused midway through the graveside prayer when Reed stepped between Evelyn and the casket. The pastor's Bible remained open in one weathered hand while the other instinctively lowered, uncertain whether to continue speaking or wait for whatever misunderstanding had suddenly interrupted the final goodbye. Evelyn had only reached inside Jordan's suit jacket to slide an old wristwatch into the breast pocket. The scratched stainless steel watch had belonged to David Monroe before cancer took him 11 years earlier. Jordan wore it every first day of school because he liked telling nervous freshmen that good music, like a good watch, only mattered if people could depend on it. Evelyn wanted her son to keep it forever. Reed did not know any of that. Dispatch had sent officers after receiving a report that a woman dressed in black appeared to be removing something from the deceased before burial. The word suspicious woman had reached him long before any names did, and somewhere during the drive across Richmond his imagination quietly filled in details that facts never had. Beside him, Officer Megan Walsh shifted uneasily as another update crackled through the patrol radio. The transmission broke apart beneath static and rainfall. Confirmed family member. Only fragments survived before Reed reached down and lowered the volume with a practiced motion, his attention fixed entirely on Evelyn. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "step away from the casket." Evelyn's eyes drifted briefly toward Jordan's peaceful face before returning to Reed. "I'm placing his father's watch where it belongs. Keep your hands where I can see them." "Officer," Reverend Price said carefully, "this is Jordan's mother." Reed acknowledged neither the pastor nor the funeral director approaching from several yards away. His focus narrowed until only Evelyn remained inside it. Behind the mourners, Rachel Collins quietly lifted the small camera Jordan had asked her to bring. He wanted a recording for students who couldn't attend because they were away at summer music camp. She pressed record without saying a word. 16-year-old Malik Thompson tightened his grip around the old silver trumpet Jordan had loaned him nearly 2 years earlier. The instrument slipped slightly in his damp hands as he watched the officer standing between a mother and her son's final farewell. Evelyn slowly opened her gloved palm. Resting there was nothing except the worn watch whose crystal reflected the gray afternoon sky. "This belonged to my husband," she said. "Now it belongs with my son." Reed looked at the watch only briefly before extending his hand again. "Turn around." Evelyn did not move. She did not argue. She simply searched his face as though hoping to find one reason this moment still made sense. "Am I being detained?" she asked. Reed answered without hesitation. "You are now." As Reverend Price quietly whispered, "Ashes to ashes." The first metal cuff closed around Evelyn Monroe's wrist, and somewhere behind the rows of folding chairs, Megan Walsh stared at the patrol radio. Realizing the sentence Dispatch had tried to finish might have changed everything before it was ever allowed to be heard. Before we continue, if you enjoy powerful stories that reveal the strength of the human spirit and the choices that shape our lives, subscribe to Narralight. Every story has a lesson, every choice has a consequence, and sometimes the smallest moment changes everything. Now, let's see what happens next. 8 hours earlier, the Monroe house had been so quiet that even the ticking kitchen clock sounded louder than usual. Evelyn Grace Monroe stood barefoot on the hardwood floor, one hand resting against the counter while the coffee she had poured nearly 20 minutes earlier sat untouched beside the sink. The first pale light of morning slipped through the blinds, drawing thin lines across framed family photographs that had remained in the same places for years. In one picture, Jordan smiled with his arm around a group of teenagers holding brass instruments after winning a statewide music competition. In another, David Monroe laughed while adjusting the old stainless steel watch that had become the family's most treasured keepsake. Evelyn slowly opened the top drawer beside the refrigerator and lifted the watch from a small velvet pouch. The crystal carried tiny scratches collected through decades of ordinary life, and the leather band had long since been replaced, but she could still picture David fastening it around his wrist before every Sunday service. After he passed away, Jordan wore it on every first day of school, joking that his father still made sure he arrived on time. Evelyn traced the edge of the watch with her thumb before placing it carefully inside the pocket of her black coat. Her cell phone vibrated across the countertop. She glanced at the screen, recognizing the number immediately, then answered with a quiet voice. "Good morning." A respectful voice began. "Your Honor, I wanted to let you know that next week's calendar has been adjusted because of—" Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment. "Thank you. I will review everything after this week. Please send my appreciation to everyone." She ended the call before another word could be spoken, leaving nothing in the room except silence once again. Today she was not thinking about hearings, courtrooms, or legal opinions. Today she was simply Jordan's mother. She walked upstairs and entered the bedroom that had remained almost untouched since the accident. A neatly folded navy blazer rested across the chair beside his desk. Music books filled the shelves, and handwritten notes from students were still pinned to the bulletin board. One card read, "Thank you for believing I could play." Another simply said, "You changed my life." Evelyn sat at the edge of the bed and unlocked her phone. Her finger hovered over the final voicemail Jordan had left 2 nights before the storm. She had listened to the first part many times, but had never found the strength to hear it through to the end. His familiar voice filled the quiet room. "Hey, Mom. I know you are probably still working. Do not worry about calling me back tonight. I just wanted you to know the kids finally mastered the ending of the concert piece." She smiled despite herself. "Malik still rushes the last measure, but he is getting better." Evelyn closed her eyes, hearing the warmth that had always made every conversation feel shorter than it really was. Then Jordan laughed softly before continuing. "There is something I want you to keep safe if something ever." Her thumb stopped the recording. She lowered the phone into her lap and inhaled slowly. She was not ready to hear the rest. Outside, rain began tapping against the bedroom window, gentle at first, then steadier. Evelyn stood, smoothed the sleeve of Jordan's blazer one final time, and carried it downstairs with careful hands. She placed the folded jacket beside the garment bag waiting near the front door, then reached for the small velvet pouch once more. The old watch felt heavier than it should have. She whispered into the quiet house, almost as though Jordan could still hear her. "Your father would want you to have this today." She picked up her umbrella, locked the front door behind her, and stepped into the gray Virginia morning, unaware that before the day ended, the same watch would become the only thing she could think about protecting. Officer Daniel Reed had started his shift before sunrise, arriving at the Henrico County Police Division with the same routine he had followed for years. His patrol vehicle had already been inspected, his reports from the previous evening had been approved, and the briefing room smelled faintly of fresh coffee and damp uniforms as officers settled into their seats. The supervisor reviewed traffic concerns, neighborhood complaints, and reminders about documenting every significant contact with the public. Reed listened without speaking, occasionally making short notes on a yellow legal pad. He believed preparation prevented mistakes, and over 14 years in uniform that belief had become almost impossible to separate from his identity. Officer Megan Walsh sat 2 chairs away, quietly reviewing updates on her department-issued tablet. She respected Reed's experience, but she had learned that his confidence sometimes left little room for questions. As they walked toward their patrol vehicle after roll call, she noticed the gray clouds already gathering over Richmond. "Looks like the rain is going to stay with us all day," she said. Reed glanced toward the sky before opening the driver's door. People still have places to be. They spent the next several hours responding to routine calls, directing traffic around a stalled pickup truck, assisting an elderly driver whose battery had failed in a grocery store parking lot, and checking on a report of a loose dog near a neighborhood elementary school. Everything remained ordinary until shortly after noon, when the radio interrupted the quiet rhythm inside the cruiser. Dispatch advised that a caller at a cemetery reported a woman dressed entirely in black removing an unknown item from a deceased person's casket shortly before burial. Reed immediately looked toward the navigation screen as the cemetery address appeared. Megan listened carefully while Dispatch continued gathering information from the caller. "Do we know whether she is family?" Megan asked before Reed had even shifted the vehicle into drive. Dispatch answered that they were attempting to verify the situation with cemetery staff. Reed activated the windshield wipers as steady rain blurred the road ahead. "We will figure that out when we arrive," he replied. Several moments later, another transmission came across the radio. The funeral director had reportedly identified the woman as the deceased's mother and stated that she had permission to approach the casket. Megan turned toward Reed. "That changes things. Maybe we should slow down and speak with the funeral director first." Reed kept his eyes on the wet roadway. "We still need to verify everything ourselves." The patrol vehicle continued through familiar Richmond streets, passing brick churches, neighborhood parks, and rows of maple trees bending beneath the rain. Neither officer noticed that the caller had remained on the line, repeating that he believed the woman had concealed something inside her coat before reaching into the casket. The statement settled into Reed's thinking more firmly than the later clarification had. Confirmation that she was family did not erase his suspicion. Instead, he convinced himself that both facts could exist at the same time. Megan looked down at the incident notes appearing on her tablet. The funeral director's update remained clearly visible, identifying the woman as Evelyn Monroe, mother of the deceased. She almost read the line aloud again but hesitated, sensing Reed had already decided how the first moments at the cemetery would unfold. As the cruiser turned through the cemetery entrance, rows of umbrellas surrounded a white canopy in the distance. Reed parked along the gravel lane, adjusted his duty belt, and stepped into the rain. Megan followed a few steps behind, carrying the weight of an unanswered question she could not quite explain. Neither of them knew that within minutes a misunderstanding, strengthened by assumption instead of careful verification, would interrupt the most painful farewell of one mother's life. The rain softened for only a few minutes, leaving a thin mist drifting between rows of polished granite headstones, while mourners quietly gathered beneath the white canopy. Funeral attendants adjusted folding chairs that had sunk slightly into the wet grass, careful not to disturb the flower arrangements surrounding Jordan Monroe's casket. White lilies, blue hydrangeas, and small cards from former students framed the polished walnut surface with messages written in careful handwriting. One card simply read, "Thank you for hearing me when nobody else did." Reverend Samuel Price stood near the head of the casket, greeting each family member with a gentle nod instead of unnecessary words. He understood that grief rarely needed conversation. It needed room. Evelyn Grace Monroe stepped from the funeral sedan, carrying a single black umbrella that remained closed despite the lingering drizzle. She preferred feeling the cool rain against her face rather than hiding from it. Rachel Collins walked beside her with a small camera hanging quietly from one shoulder. "I will stay out of everyone's way," Rachel said softly. "Jordan wanted the students who could not be here to see today." Evelyn answered with a faint smile. "He always thought about someone else first." A few feet away, 16-year-old Malik Thompson stood with 3 classmates from Jordan's music program. Each teenager wore a borrowed dark suit that fit just well enough for the occasion, and each held an instrument with nervous hands. Malik noticed Evelyn approaching and stepped forward. "Mrs. Monroe," he said, lowering his trumpet, "we practiced the ending exactly the way he taught us." Evelyn reached out and gently straightened the slightly crooked tie beneath his collar. "Then he is already proud of you." Malik swallowed hard before returning to the group. As the service began, Reverend Price welcomed everyone with a calm voice that blended naturally with the quiet rain. He spoke about Jordan's patience, his gift for encouraging discouraged students, and the extraordinary way he remembered every child's name after meeting them only once. Several teenagers smiled through tears as stories were shared about after-school rehearsals, neighborhood concerts, and the afternoons Jordan spent repairing broken instruments so families would not have to buy new ones. There was no mention of awards or recognition. Those things had never mattered much to Jordan. When the final prayer concluded, the attendants carefully opened the casket one last time for the family's private farewell. The crowd respectfully stepped back, giving Evelyn the space no parent ever wished to need. She rested one hand lightly along the polished edge of the casket and looked peacefully at her son's face. The months of planning, paperwork, phone calls, and impossible decisions disappeared into one unbearable truth. This was goodbye. She slowly removed the old stainless steel watch from her coat pocket. For a long moment, she simply held it between both gloved hands. "Your father never missed an important day," she whispered. "Neither will you." She gently slipped the watch into the breast pocket of Jordan's navy suit, smoothing the fabric afterward as though preparing him for another ordinary morning at school. Behind her, Rachel quietly raised the camera only after making certain she would not intrude on the family's final moment. Reverend Price lowered his eyes, allowing silence to become its own prayer. At the edge of the cemetery, tires crunched across the wet gravel entrance road. Few mourners paid attention at first. They assumed another late arrival had finally found the service despite the weather. Instead, a marked Henrico County Patrol vehicle rolled slowly toward the gathering before stopping several yards away. Officer Daniel Reed stepped out first, adjusting his rain jacket as he surveyed the scene. Officer Megan Walsh followed, glancing from the dispatch notes on her department tablet toward the funeral director already walking in their direction with concern written plainly across his face. Evelyn remained beside Jordan's casket, unaware that the peaceful farewell she had struggled to hold together all morning was only seconds away from being interrupted by a decision that had already begun forming long before anyone spoke a single word to her. Officer Daniel Reed walked across the wet grass with measured steps, his boots leaving shallow impressions that quickly filled with rainwater. The funeral director raised one hand before Reed reached the canopy. "Officer, the service is still in progress," he said respectfully. "If there is a concern, I can answer your questions over here." Reed gave a brief nod without slowing. "We received a report about possible removal of property from the deceased. I need to speak with the woman at the casket." The funeral director glanced toward Evelyn and lowered his voice. "She is Jordan Monroe's mother. Everything she is doing has my permission." Megan Walsh looked from the funeral director to the notes displayed on her department tablet. The same information had already appeared from dispatch, and hearing it again only deepened the uneasy feeling she had carried since leaving the patrol vehicle. Reed thanked the funeral director, but continued forward anyway. Reverend Samuel Price noticed the officers approaching and quietly stepped aside from the casket. He hoped the conversation would be brief enough that the family could return to the farewell without further interruption. Evelyn remained beside Jordan, gently smoothing the front of his navy suit after placing David's old watch inside the breast pocket. For several seconds, she simply looked at her son's peaceful face, committing every detail to memory before the casket would close forever. Reed stopped a few feet away. "Ma'am," he said in a calm but firm voice, "please step away from the casket." Evelyn turned slowly. Her expression showed exhaustion more than surprise. "May I ask why?" Reed answered without raising his voice. "We received information that an item may have been removed or concealed during the viewing." Evelyn looked briefly at the open casket before returning her attention to him. "I placed my late husband's watch in my son's pocket." She lifted her empty hands slightly to show that she carried nothing else. "It belongs with him." Reverend Price spoke gently. "Officer, I was standing here the entire time. That is exactly what happened." The funeral director nodded in agreement. "I can confirm that as well." Reed listened but remained focused on Evelyn. "Do you have identification with you?" Evelyn glanced toward the first row of folding chairs where her handbag rested beneath a black umbrella. "Yes, my purse is right there." Reed followed her line of sight, but did not move. "Please leave it where it is for now." Megan stepped closer, keeping her tone quiet enough that only Reed could hear. "Dispatch already confirmed she is immediate family." Reed answered without looking at her. "I am verifying the situation myself." Rachel Collins continued recording from a respectful distance. She never zoomed in on Evelyn's face, keeping the entire scene within the frame exactly as Jordan had taught his students to document rehearsals honestly instead of dramatically. Malik tightened both hands around his trumpet, unable to understand why strangers had suddenly become part of the most painful day of Mrs. Monroe's life. Rain tapped softly against the canopy again, filling the silence between every sentence. Evelyn spoke with remarkable composure. "Officer, if you believe there is a legal concern, I will answer reasonable questions. But I would like to finish saying goodbye to my son first. Reed studied her for a long moment. Her calmness did not reassure him. Instead, he mistakenly interpreted it as resistance wrapped in polite language. He extended one hand toward the open casket. I need you to step away now. Evelyn lowered her eyes to Jordan one final time before looking back at Reed. Am I free to remain with my son? Reed's expression hardened as the question hung in the damp afternoon air. Around them, every conversation stopped. Even the teenagers holding their instruments stood perfectly still. After a brief pause that seemed much longer than it truly was, Reed gave the answer that changed the direction of the entire day. No, ma'am. At this moment, you are being detained while we determine exactly what happened here. The words settled over the cemetery more heavily than the rain itself. Evelyn Grace Monroe did not argue, raise her voice, or pull away. She simply lowered her eyes toward Jordan's casket one more time, as though silently apologizing that his final farewell had become something neither of them could have imagined. May I close his jacket first? She asked quietly. Reed hesitated for only a moment before answering. Please keep your hands where I can see them. Evelyn slowly turned both gloved palms outward, showing they were empty. The watch is already inside his pocket. I only wanted to straighten his lapel. Reverend Samuel Price stepped closer, careful to keep his tone calm. Officer, there is no threat here. Every person standing under this canopy watched Mrs. Monroe place her husband's watch with her son. Nothing has been removed. The funeral director immediately nodded. That is correct. I authorized the family to spend a private moment before we closed the casket. Reed listened, but remained committed to the decision he had already made. I appreciate the information. We still have a responsibility to investigate the complaint. Megan Walsh quietly looked around the gathering. No one appeared frightened. No one appeared confrontational. Most simply looked confused, uncertain how a funeral had become the subject of a police investigation. She leaned toward Reed and spoke softly enough that only he could hear. Daniel, maybe we should speak with the reporting party first. We already have multiple witnesses telling us the same thing. Reed answered without taking his eyes off Evelyn. If we delay and evidence disappears, we cannot recover it later. Megan looked toward the open casket. The statement felt strangely disconnected from everything unfolding before them. Rachel Collins continued recording without moving closer. Her camera captured the silence between sentences, the lowered umbrellas, the students standing shoulder to shoulder, and the expression on Evelyn's face that somehow carried dignity even beneath public humiliation. Malik Thompson swallowed hard and whispered to another student. Mrs. Monroe has never even raised her voice at anyone. His friend gave a small nod, but said nothing. Neither teenager understood why adults who had never met Jordan seemed unwilling to listen to the people who knew him best. Evelyn finally spoke again. Officer, before you do anything else, may I ask one favor? Reed remained cautious. What is your request? She looked toward Jordan. Please allow them to close my son's casket with respect. He deserves that much. The funeral attendants exchanged uncertain glances, waiting for some indication that they could continue. Reed paused. There was nothing unlawful about closing the casket, and refusing such a request in front of dozens of mourners would accomplish little. He gave a short nod. Go ahead. Without stepping closer herself, Evelyn looked toward the attendants. They gently folded the jacket over Jordan's shoulders, ensuring the old watch remained hidden safely inside the breast pocket exactly where she had placed it. The polished walnut lid was lowered slowly until the quiet click of the latch echoed beneath the canopy. Several students quietly wiped tears from their faces. Reverend Price bowed his head once more. May his memory always be a blessing. Evelyn closed her eyes for one brief moment after the casket was sealed. When she opened them again, her grief remained visible, but something steadier had settled beside it. She turned back toward Reed with calm composure. Thank you for allowing that. Reed gestured toward the gravel path leading away from the family gathering. Please come with us so we can continue our investigation. Evelyn nodded once. I will cooperate. She took a slow step away from her son's casket, leaving behind the final goodbye every mother hopes will never be interrupted, while dozens of silent witnesses watched a woman who had shown nothing except patience walk away from the place where her heart had just been buried. The walk from the graveside to the gravel access road measured less than 100 feet, Yet it felt longer than the years Evelyn Grace Monroe had spent inside federal courtrooms listening to families whose lives had changed in a single afternoon. She moved at a steady pace beside Officer Daniel Reed, neither resisting nor hurrying, while Officer Megan Walsh remained a respectful step behind. The rain had eased into a cool mist that settled across the cemetery, leaving tiny drops clinging to Evelyn's black coat. Behind them, the mourners remained under the white canopy, watching in complete silence. No one shouted. No one rushed forward. The quiet itself carried the weight of protest. Reverend Samuel Price finally broke the silence. "Mrs. Monroe," he called gently, "we will remain here until you return." Evelyn looked back with a grateful expression and gave the smallest nod before continuing toward the patrol vehicle. Rachel Collins lowered her camera for the first time since the officers had arrived. She checked the recording briefly, making certain it had captured the entire encounter without interruption. Jordan had always reminded his students that truth did not need dramatic editing. It only needed to be preserved. She slipped the camera strap over her shoulder again and quietly walked toward Reverend Price. "I think this recording may become important," she whispered. The pastor looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Keep it safe." Nearby, Malik Thompson still held his trumpet against his chest. He stared toward the patrol vehicle, unable to reconcile the woman who had encouraged him before every school concert with the person now being questioned beside a police cruiser. "She did not do anything wrong," he murmured. One of Jordan's fellow teachers rested a reassuring hand on his shoulder, but found no words that felt adequate. At the patrol vehicle, Reed stopped beside the rear passenger door. He removed a small department notebook from his pocket. "Mrs. Monroe, I need your full name and identification." Evelyn answered calmly. "My purse is still under the front row of chairs beside my umbrella. I informed you of that earlier." Megan immediately spoke. "I can retrieve it." Reed considered the request before giving a brief nod. "Do not leave it unattended once you pick it up." Megan walked back toward the canopy while Reed remained with Evelyn. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. The only sound came from rainwater dripping off nearby oak branches onto the gravel below. Finally, Reed asked, "Can you explain why you placed the watch inside the casket?" Evelyn looked toward the distant canopy where Jordan's casket rested. "Because it belonged to his father. My husband wore that watch every day until cancer took his life. After that, Jordan wore it on every first day of school to remind himself what kind of man he wanted to become. Today it became part of our family's goodbye." Reed wrote several notes without looking up. "Was anyone else aware you intended to place it there?" "The funeral director knew. Reverend Price knew. My family knew." She paused briefly. Nothing about it was hidden. Reed finished writing but did not respond immediately. Megan returned carrying Evelyn's black leather handbag. She handed it to Reed, who placed it on the hood of the patrol vehicle. "Mrs. Monroe," Megan said gently, "would you please remove your identification for us?" Evelyn unzipped the bag herself after Reed agreed. Inside were ordinary personal items, reading glasses, a small packet of tissues, a folded funeral program, and a slim leather wallet. She removed a driver's license and handed it to Megan. Megan glanced down at the card, then looked back at Evelyn. Something about the name seemed unexpectedly familiar, though she could not immediately place why. Before she could think further, the patrol radio suddenly crackled to life again, with a dispatcher requesting an immediate status update from Unit 12. Unaware that the next few words transmitted across that radio were about to reshape every assumption made since the officers first entered the cemetery. The sudden burst of static from the patrol radio interrupted the silence before the dispatcher spoke with unusual urgency. "Unit 12, update to your current call. Reporting party has been recontacted. Funeral home staff confirms the individual is the deceased's mother. No complaint has been made by the family or funeral director. Please advise your status." Reed reached for the radio microphone without taking his eyes off Evelyn. "Unit 12, we are conducting a field investigation. Stand by." He released the button and clipped the microphone back into place. Megan looked at him carefully. "Dispatch just confirmed exactly what we have been hearing from everyone here." Reed remained composed. "The original caller believed something improper had occurred. We still need to document the contact." Evelyn stood quietly beside the patrol vehicle, her hands folded in front of her black coat. She had spent decades listening to people become defensive when their decisions were questioned. She recognized the tone immediately. It was no longer about discovering facts. It was about defending an earlier judgment. Megan examined the driver's license once more. Mrs. Monroe, is this your current address? Evelyn answered politely. Yes, it is. Megan read the full name again. Evelyn Grace Monroe. The name continued to trouble her memory. She had heard it somewhere before, not socially, but professionally. Before she could place it, Reed asked another question. Do you have any documentation showing permission to place personal property inside the casket? The funeral director, who had quietly approached again, answered before Evelyn could speak. Officer, no written authorization is required. Families make those decisions every day. We document requests involving hazardous materials or valuables being removed, but placing a sentimental item with a loved one is entirely normal. Reed acknowledged the explanation with a brief nod, but continued writing in his notebook. Several yards away, Rachel Collins noticed more mourners quietly taking out their phones. No one moved closer. No one interfered. They simply watched, uncertain whether they were witnessing a misunderstanding or something much larger. Reverend Samuel Price folded his hands together and remained beside Jordan's closed casket. His eyes never left Evelyn. Malik Thompson finally walked toward the pastor. Should somebody call a lawyer? He whispered. Reverend Price answered gently. Not yet. Right now we remain calm and let truth catch up. Evelyn slowly turned toward Reed. Officer, have I been accused of committing a crime? Reed paused before answering. At this time we are determining the facts. Then I will continue answering your questions, she replied. But I would appreciate being treated with the same dignity you would extend to any parent standing beside their child's grave. Her voice never rose above conversation level, yet the words settled heavily over everyone within earshot. Even Reed hesitated for a fraction of a second before looking back at his notebook. Megan handed Evelyn's driver's license back to her. As Evelyn returned it to her wallet, a dark blue identification wallet tucked behind it became briefly visible before slipping partly back into the leather compartment. Megan noticed only the edge of a gold-colored seal embossed into the cover before the wallet closed again. She frowned slightly, convinced she had seen a similar seal during courthouse security training several years earlier. Before she could ask about it, Reed received another radio call requesting the name of the individual involved for the incident log. Reed glanced toward Evelyn. Ma'am, for the record, please state your full legal name. Evelyn met his eyes with the same calm composure she had carried since the officers arrived. My name is Evelyn Grace Monroe. Reed repeated the name into the microphone, unaware that someone listening on the other end was about to recognize it instantly. Before we continue, if you enjoy inspiring stories about courage, second chances, and people who choose kindness when it matters most, subscribe to Narralight. Our stories remind us that one decision, one voice, or one act of compassion can change a life forever. Now, let's see what happened next. For nearly 3 seconds, nothing came back over the radio except the faint hiss of static mixed with rainfall. Then the dispatcher's voice returned, no longer carrying the casual rhythm of routine communications. Unit 12, please confirm the spelling of the individual's name. Reed glanced toward Evelyn. Evelyn. Echo Victor Echo Lima Yankee November. Grace. Monroe. Mary November Romeo Oscar Echo. Another pause followed. Megan noticed the dispatcher's breathing before the reply finally arrived. Unit 12, stand by. Supervisor is requesting clarification. Reed frowned slightly. Requests like that were unusual during a simple field interview. He pressed the transmit button again. Clarification regarding what? Stand by. The dispatcher repeated, her voice noticeably more careful than before. Reed clipped the microphone back onto his shoulder and looked at Evelyn. It appears there is a question about your identity. Evelyn answered with complete composure. There never was a question about my identity, officer. Only about whether anyone was willing to verify it before making assumptions. Reed did not respond. Several feet away, Megan quietly replayed the moment she had glimpsed the dark blue identification wallet. The gold seal. The familiar texture. The memory finally surfaced from years earlier when she attended a courthouse orientation after being assigned to assist with security during a high-profile federal proceeding. The credential had looked remarkably similar. She glanced toward Evelyn's handbag again before speaking carefully. Mrs. Monroe, may I ask what kind of identification was inside the blue wallet? Evelyn met her eyes without hesitation. You may ask. Megan waited respectfully. Would you be willing to show it? Before Evelyn could answer, Reed interrupted. That is not necessary right now. Megan turned toward him. It may answer every remaining question. Reed hesitated. His radio interrupted again before either of them could continue. This time the voice belonged not to dispatch, but to Lieutenant Andrew Collins, the shift supervisor. Unit 12, contact me immediately on the secure channel. Reed acknowledged the instruction and stepped several yards away to switch radio channels, leaving Megan standing beside Evelyn. For the first time since arriving, the conversation became unexpectedly personal. Megan lowered her voice. Mrs. Monroe, I am sorry your day has been interrupted. Evelyn offered a tired but sincere smile. Thank you for saying that. Megan hesitated before continuing. I keep feeling as though I know your name from somewhere. Evelyn looked briefly toward the closed casket beneath the white canopy. Perhaps from the courthouse. Megan searched her face, then suddenly understood. Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly. Federal court? Evelyn gave the smallest nod. Yes. Megan drew a slow breath, but did not ask another question. She simply looked toward Reed, who remained turned away speaking into the radio. Under the canopy, Reverend Samuel Price noticed Megan's expression change. Rachel Collins noticed it as well through the viewfinder of her camera. Neither could hear the conversation, but both sensed that something important had shifted. Reed returned a moment later, his expression noticeably more serious than before. He looked first at Megan, then at Evelyn. My supervisor is on the way, he said. He requested that everyone remain exactly where they are until he arrives. Evelyn inclined her head politely. I have nowhere else to be today. The words carried no anger, only quiet heartbreak. She looked once more toward the casket where her son rested while the mist drifted gently across the cemetery. Around them, every witness remained silent, waiting as truth moved steadily closer, one careful question at a time. The sound of another patrol vehicle approached slowly along the wet gravel road before stopping several yards behind Officer Daniel Reed's cruiser. Lieutenant Andrew Collins stepped out, buttoning his rain jacket as he surveyed the quiet gathering. He noticed the funeral canopy, the closed casket surrounded by flowers, the line of mourners who had not yet left, and finally Evelyn Grace Monroe standing calmly beside the patrol vehicle. Reed walked toward his supervisor and summarized the situation in a measured voice. We responded to a report that an individual may have removed or concealed property during a burial. Multiple witnesses identified her as the decedent's mother. We detained her briefly while determining the facts. Collins listened without interruption. Has anyone alleged that property is missing? No. Has the funeral director reported criminal activity? No. Has any family member requested police assistance? Reed answered each question with the same single word. No. Collins remained silent for several seconds before looking toward the funeral director, who immediately confirmed that no crime had occurred and that placing sentimental belongings with the deceased was a common family practice. Reverend Samuel Price quietly added that every step of the farewell had taken place in full view of those present. Collins thanked both men before turning toward Megan Walsh. Officer, have you verified her identification? Megan nodded respectfully. I confirmed her driver's license, Lieutenant. I also believe there is additional official identification, although I have not requested to examine it. Collins looked toward Evelyn. Mrs. Monroe, I apologize for the interruption to your family's service. If you are comfortable doing so, would you please show me whatever official identification Officer Walsh mentioned? It may help us resolve this matter immediately. Evelyn studied his expression for a moment. Unlike the earlier questions, this one carried neither accusation nor assumption. It simply sought confirmation. She slowly opened her black leather wallet again. Behind her driver's license rested the dark blue credential Megan had noticed earlier. Evelyn removed it carefully and handed it to Lieutenant Collins. He opened the leather cover. The gold seal immediately caught the gray afternoon light. His eyes moved to the identification card beneath it, then stopped completely. For several long seconds, he said nothing at all. Reed watched his supervisor's expression shift from routine concentration to unmistakable disbelief. Collins looked back at Evelyn before quietly reading the identification one more time, ensuring he had not misunderstood. Finally, he closed the credential with deliberate care and returned it using both hands. Thank you, Your Honor, he said softly. The title seemed to freeze the air beneath the overcast sky. Reed stared at his supervisor, uncertain whether he had heard correctly. Megan lowered her eyes briefly, realizing the memory that had troubled her since seeing the blue wallet had finally found its answer. Evelyn accepted the credential without triumph or satisfaction. She simply placed it back inside her wallet. Collins turned toward Reed. His voice remained professional, but every word carried unmistakable weight. Mrs. Monroe serves as a United States District Judge. No one spoke. Even the rain seemed quieter than before. Reed looked back at Evelyn, seeing the same woman who had answered every question calmly, requested only the chance to finish saying goodbye to her son, and cooperated without complaint despite the public interruption of his funeral. Nothing about her had changed. Only his understanding had. Across the cemetery, Rachel Collins lowered her camera for the first time since recording began. Malik Thompson looked toward Reverend Samuel Price, whose eyes remained fixed on Evelyn with quiet compassion. The pastor whispered almost to himself, "Character always reveals itself before titles do." Evelyn stood exactly where she had been only moments earlier, still a grieving mother, still dressed in black, still carrying the same quiet dignity she had possessed before anyone knew the office she held. The difference was that, at last, everyone around her understood who she had been all along. Officer Daniel Reed felt the weight of the moment settle more heavily than the rain soaking through his uniform. His eyes remained fixed on Evelyn Grace Monroe, but the image before him had changed completely. Minutes earlier, he had seen only a suspicious stranger standing beside a casket. Now he realized he had interrupted a grieving mother who had answered every question with patience while quietly carrying the responsibility of serving as a United States District Judge. Lieutenant Andrew Collins stepped closer to Reed, keeping his voice low enough that only the officers could hear. "Remove the detention immediately. There is no legal basis to continue this contact." Reed nodded almost automatically. The certainty that had guided every earlier decision disappeared, replaced by an uncomfortable silence he could not escape. Collins turned back toward Evelyn. "Your Honor, on behalf of this department, I sincerely apologize for the disruption to your son's funeral. This situation should have been handled differently." Evelyn looked toward the white canopy, where Jordan's casket remained surrounded by flowers and students who still had not left. "Lieutenant, I appreciate your words." She paused before continuing. "But I hope you understand something important." Collins listened without interrupting. "The hardest part of today is not that I was questioned. Police officers have a responsibility to ask questions when something appears unusual." Her eyes briefly met Reed's. "The hardest part is that no one stopped to believe the answers that were already being given." The sentence lingered in the quiet air long after she finished speaking. Reed lowered his eyes. He replayed every moment since arriving at the cemetery. The funeral director had explained the situation. Reverend Price had confirmed it. Dispatch had updated the information. Megan had urged caution. Every fact had pointed in the same direction, yet he had continued following the first assumption instead of the strongest evidence. Lieutenant Collins nodded slowly. "That is a fair observation." Evelyn answered gently. "Justice begins with listening. Courtrooms are built on that principle, but so are ordinary conversations." She looked toward the students waiting beneath the canopy. "My son spent his career teaching children that every person deserved to be heard before being judged. I wish he could have finished teaching that lesson today himself." No one answered immediately. Even Reed understood that nothing he could say would erase what had already happened. Rachel Collins quietly lowered her camera. She had expected to record the end of a funeral. Instead, she had witnessed something Jordan often spoke about during school assemblies. Character was revealed not when life became easy, but when dignity was tested. Reverend Samuel Price slowly approached the group. "Mrs. Monroe," he said softly, "whenever you are ready, we would like to complete the final prayer." Evelyn smiled faintly. "Thank you, Reverend. I would like that very much." Before she turned away, Reed finally spoke. His voice carried none of the certainty that had defined it earlier. "Your Honor, Mrs. Monroe." He stopped, searching for words that seemed painfully inadequate. "I am sorry." Evelyn regarded him quietly. There was no anger in her expression, only deep exhaustion. "Officer Reed," she replied, "whether you become a better officer after today is entirely your decision. Whether I carry bitterness after today is mine." She gave him a small, respectful nod before walking back toward the canopy where family, friends, students, and neighbors waited to finish saying goodbye to Jordan. Reed remained standing beside the patrol vehicle, watching the grieving mother return to her son's casket with the same calm dignity she had carried from the very beginning, realizing that the most powerful authority he had witnessed all afternoon had never come from a badge or a judicial appointment. It had come from a woman who refused to let grief become an excuse to abandon grace. Reverend Samuel Price returned to the front of the gathering and waited until Evelyn Grace Monroe reached the first row of chairs before quietly opening his Bible once again. No one hurried her. Every mourner understood that the service had been interrupted in a way that could never be repeated, and every person instinctively gave her the time she needed to reclaim the moment. Evelyn stopped beside Jordan's casket and rested one gloved hand gently on the polished wood. She closed her eyes for several seconds before drawing a slow breath. "I am ready," she said softly. The pastor nodded. "Then let us honor the life Jordan lived." The students lifted their instruments one final time. Instead of a polished concert performance, they played the simple hymn Jordan had chosen months earlier after helping organize another family's memorial service. A few notes wavered as tears interrupted steady breathing, but no one cared about perfection. Jordan had always taught them that music was never about flawless technique. It was about telling the truth. The melody drifted quietly across the cemetery while rain rested lightly on the umbrellas surrounding the gravesite. Officer Daniel Reed remained beside the patrol vehicle with Lieutenant Andrew Collins and Officer Megan Walsh. None of the three officers spoke during the hymn. Reed watched Malik Thompson lower his trumpet after the final note faded into silence. He watched former students embrace one another. He watched Evelyn stand motionless beside her son's casket without seeking sympathy or attention. For the first time that afternoon, he fully understood what had been taken from her. It had not simply been several interrupted minutes. It had been the peaceful farewell every family deserved. When the prayer concluded, funeral attendants slowly prepared to lower the casket. Evelyn stepped forward one last time and whispered words only she and Jordan would ever know. Then she placed her hand over the wood for a brief moment before stepping back. The attendants completed their work with quiet dignity. Several students left white roses beside the grave. Malik carefully laid his old silver trumpet case against the chair for a moment before placing a folded sheet of music among the flowers. "He told me never to quit," he whispered. "So I will not." Rachel Collins approached Evelyn after the family had begun greeting friends. "I have the recording," she said gently. "I will keep it private unless you ever ask for it." Evelyn smiled with sincere gratitude. "Thank you." Jordan believed that truth mattered, even when it was uncomfortable. Preserve it exactly as it happened. Rachel nodded. "I will." Lieutenant Andrew Collins walked toward Evelyn once the mourners began quietly leaving the graveside. "Mrs. Monroe, I will personally review today's incident and ensure every report accurately reflects what occurred. That is my responsibility." Evelyn looked at him kindly. "Accuracy matters. Not because of my position, but because the next person may not have one." Collins lowered his head in acknowledgement. "I understand." Reed finally stepped forward. His voice remained subdued. "Mrs. Monroe, I cannot change what happened today." Evelyn answered with calm honesty. "No, Officer Reed. Neither of us can." He hesitated before continuing. "But I can learn from it." She regarded him for a long moment before offering the smallest smile she had shown all afternoon. "Then make certain the lesson reaches someone beyond yourself. That is how mistakes become worthwhile." Reed nodded silently. There was nothing more to say. As the cemetery slowly emptied beneath the clearing Virginia sky, the first thin rays of afternoon sunlight broke through the clouds and settled across the fresh earth surrounding Jordan's grave. Evelyn remained there for one final quiet moment before turning toward the path leading home, carrying the same grief she had arrived with, but also the quiet hope that her son's final lesson had reached hearts he would never have the chance to teach himself. 3 weeks later, the rain had long disappeared from Richmond, but the memory of that afternoon had not. Inside the federal courthouse, Judge Evelyn Grace Monroe resumed her work exactly as she always had. She entered the courtroom through the same hallway, greeted the deputy clerk with the same quiet smile, and listened to every attorney, witness, and defendant with the same patience that had defined her career for years. No one who watched her conduct proceedings could have guessed that only days earlier she had buried her only son. Grief remained with her, but it no longer spoke louder than her commitment to fairness. Across town, Officer Daniel Reed sat alone in a training room after his shift, reviewing the written report from the cemetery one final time before submitting the corrected version. Lieutenant Andrew Collins had required every detail to match the verified facts rather than the original assumptions. Reed read each sentence slowly. For the first time in his career, he realized how easily confidence could become a substitute for careful listening. Before signing the report, he added one final sentence explaining that witness statements had consistently confirmed the family's lawful actions from the beginning of the encounter. It did not erase the mistake, but it ensured the official record reflected the truth. Weeks later, the department introduced a revised field training discussion emphasizing the importance of verifying information from multiple credible sources before escalating emotionally sensitive encounters. Lieutenant Collins never mentioned Evelyn Monroe by name during those sessions. He simply reminded younger officers that professionalism required curiosity before certainty. Megan Walsh attended every discussion. She quietly hoped that one family's painful experience might spare another from enduring the same interruption. At Jefferson High School, the new music teacher discovered a neatly labeled storage cabinet left untouched after Jordan Monroe's passing. Inside rested handwritten lesson plans, repaired instruments waiting for students who needed them, and dozens of encouraging notes Jordan had prepared for children before concerts and auditions. One envelope carried Malik Thompson's name. Inside, Jordan had written only one sentence. Talent opens the first door. Character opens every door after that. Malik folded the note carefully and placed it inside his trumpet case, deciding he would carry it to every performance for the rest of his life. Rachel Collins never released the cemetery recording publicly. She honored her promise exactly as she had given it. Instead, she stored the video safely with Jordan's family, believing some moments deserved preservation rather than attention. Reverend Samuel Price occasionally visited Jordan's grave after Sunday services. Fresh flowers appeared there often, left by former students whose lives had quietly changed because one teacher had chosen patience over recognition, encouragement over praise, and service over applause. One autumn afternoon, Officer Reed returned to the cemetery alone. He carried no flowers and expected no forgiveness. He simply stood several feet from Jordan's headstone, removed his cap, and remained silent for several minutes. Before leaving, he spoke softly into the still afternoon air. "I cannot change that day, but I will not repeat it." No one answered except the gentle movement of leaves through the old oak trees. It was enough. On the same afternoon, Evelyn arrived carrying a small bouquet of white lilies. She noticed Reed's patrol vehicle pulling away as she entered the cemetery, but made no effort to stop him. Instead, she walked to Jordan's grave, arranged the flowers beside the headstone, and rested one hand gently against the cool stone. The sunlight filtered through the branches above, warming the grass where shadows had once stretched beneath gray skies. "Your lesson reached farther than either of us expected," she whispered. "I wish you could have seen it." She remained there quietly before turning toward the path home with unhurried steps. She had not changed the world in a single afternoon. She had simply refused to surrender her dignity when it would have been easiest to do so. In the end, that quiet choice reached more hearts than anger ever could. Jordan's music had ended, but the lesson he left behind continued wherever people chose to listen before judging, to understand before assuming, and to remember that every person standing in front of them carried a story they had not yet taken the time to hear. If this story meant something to you, subscribe to Narralight for more powerful stories that remind us to look beyond appearances, challenge prejudice, and never underestimate the impact of doing what's right. Because sometimes, the smallest act of courage creates the biggest change. Thank you for watching. Remember, the world changes one choice at a time. We'll see you in the next story.